The blade came down. Again, the cold steel biting into his neck, the searing pain exploding through his nerves as his vision darkened. The crowd's cheers ringing in his ears like a twisted symphony, their faces blurred, but their voices sharp. Mocking, reveling in his suffering, his body collapsing to the ground like a discarded puppet. His blood pooling beneath him, thick and warm. The scent of iron filling his nostrils. The last thing he saw was his brother's smirk, Lushan's golden eyes gleaming with triumph. The bastard who had sold him out, who had whispered lies into the emperor's ear, who had taken everything from him, his title, his honor, his life, and then blackness, silence. The void swallowing him whole, but this time, unlike the 100 times before, he didn't scream, didn't beg, he didn't flinch, because this time, he remembered every single death, every single betrayal, every single moment of agony etched into his soul like a brand, and when his eyes snapped open, the world was bright, too bright. The sun assaulting his vision, the air burning his lungs. The weight of his armor familiar yet foreign, the clang of steel around him, the shouts of soldiers, the scent of sweat and dirt, the battlefield, the same battlefield where it had all begun. Where Lucian had first betrayed him, where he had died the first time, the second, and the third, and now, here he was again, standing amidst the chaos, his sword heavy in his hand. His heart pounding not with fear but with fury, because this time he wouldn't die. This time he wouldn't fall. This time he would make them pay, every single one of them. The empire, the nobles, his brother, especially his brother, the traitor who had sold his soul for power, the coward who had stabbed him in the back, the monster who had laughed as the executioner's axe fell, and as the enemy soldiers charged, their blades glinting in the sunlight. Their faces twisted with bloodlust. He moved, his body reacting on instinct, his muscles remembering the countless battles he had fought, the countless deaths he had endured, his sword cutting through flesh and bone like paper. The screams of his enemies' music to his ears, the blood spraying his face, warm and sticky. The taste of copper on his lips, the thrill of vengeance surging through his veins, because this was just the beginning. This was just the first step. And when the battle ended, when the field was littered with corpses, when the survivors fled in terror, he stood there, panting. His chest heaving, his armor dented and bloodied, his sword dripping red, and he smiled, a cold, vicious smile, because he knew this time he wouldn't stop, this time. He would tear the empire apart brick by brick. He would hunt down every last person who had wronged him. He would make them suffer as he had suffered. He would make them beg for death as he had begged. And when he was done, when the world burned at his feet, only then would he rest. Only then would the cycle end. But until then, there would be no mercy, no hesitation, no weakness, because this time, he wasn't the prey, he wasn't the victim, he wasn't the one who died. This time, he was the hunter, the killer, the nightmare, and the empire would learn to fear him. Lucian would learn to fear him. They would all learn to fear the man who had died 100 times and still kept coming back. The man who had clawed his way out of hell itself. The man who would drown the world in blood if that's what it took to win. And as the sun set, casting long shadows across the battlefield, he turned his gaze toward the imperial capital, toward the palace where his brother sat on a stolen throne, and he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind, "I'm coming for you, brother. And this time, you won't see the knife until it's already in your back." The days that followed were a blur of violence and strategy. His movements calculated, his strikes precise as enemies. Falling like wheat before the scythe, the rumors spreading like wildfire. The empire whispering of a demon on the battlefield, a wraith who couldn't be killed, a monster who laughed as he slaughtered. And he let them talk, let them fear. Because fear was a weapon, fear was a tool. Fear would make them sloppy, would make them desperate, and desperation led to mistakes. Mistakes he would exploit, mistakes he would use to rip the empire apart from the inside. And as he moved from town to town, from stronghold to stronghold, he gathered allies. Not out of trust, never out of trust, but out of necessity, because even a monster needed pawns, needed tools, needed bodies to throw at the empire's walls, and among them was Sylvia, the rogue assassin, who had died in his arms in a dozen different lifetimes, her crimson hair like a banner of war, her daggers sharp as her tongue, her loyalty questionable, but her skills undeniable. When she asked why he fought, why he killed, why he didn't just run, he looked at her, his eyes empty, his voice flat. Because I've already run 100 times, and it never ends well. And she didn't press further, because she saw something in his gaze. Something dark, something broken, something that sent a shiver down her spine, something that made her wonder if he was even human anymore, or if he was something else, something worse, something born from 100 graves, 100 pyres, 100 execution blocks. And as they traveled, as they plotted, as they killed, the Empire's response grew fiercer, their forces larger, their tactics more brutal. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered. Because he had already died 100 times, and death held no terror for him. Pain held no terror for him. The only thing that mattered was vengeance. The only thing that mattered was making them pay. And when the Imperial legions finally cornered them in the ruins of an old fortress, the walls crumbling, the air thick with the scent of rain and blood, he didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, didn't surrender. He just smiled, that same cold, vicious smile, and raised his sword, because this was what he had been waiting for. This was the moment he would show the Empire true fear. This was the moment he would teach them what it meant to hunt a man who had nothing left to lose. And as the first arrows flew, as the first soldiers charged, as the first blood was spilled, he laughed, a sound devoid of joy, devoid of humanity, a sound that echoed through the ruins like a death knell, a sound that promised only suffering, only slaughter, only revenge. And then he moved his blade. A blur, his body a storm, his enemies falling like leaves in the wind, their screams, did his symphony their blood, his paint the battlefield, his canvas. And when the dust settled, when the last soldier fell, when the silence returned, he stood there, drenched in red, his breath steady, his heart calm, his soul burning with a fire that would never be extinguished. Not until the Empire was ash, not until Lucian was dust, not until the world itself remembered his name and trembled, and as he wiped his blade clean, as he turned to face the horizon, toward the capital, toward his brother, toward his destiny, he knew this was only the beginning. This was only the first act, and the real war had yet to begin. The fortress ruins still reeked of blood and iron as Kael stepped over the corpses of Imperial soldiers. Their lifeless eyes staring at the storm-choked sky, their final expressions frozen in terror, their armor shattered. Like eggshells beneath his blade, the rain washing their blood into the mud in dark rivers that snaked between the broken stones. The scent of death thick enough to choke on. But he didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, didn't even blink. Because death had long since ceased to faze him. Death was an old friend, a constant companion, a shadow that had followed him through 100 lifetimes. And as he turned to Sylvia, her crimson hair plastered to her face by the downpour, her daggers dripping red, her breath coming in sharp gasps, he saw the question in her eyes, the unspoken doubt, the flicker of fear. Not of him, but for him, because even she, a killer forged in the Empire's darkest alleys, could sense the wrongness in him, the emptiness where a soul should have been, the void where mercy once lived. And when she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible over the thunder. They'll send more, they'll send worse, they won't stop until you're dead. He just smiled that hollow, terrifying smile and said, let them come, let them all come. I've died 100 times. What's one more? And the way he said it, the casual indifference, the utter lack of fear made her blood run cold, because she realized that he wasn't just willing to die, he expected it, he welcomed it as long as he could drag the Empire down with him, as long as he could take Lucian with him, as long as he could make them suffer, and that realization should have made her run, should have made her abandon this madness. But instead it hooked into her like a barb, because she'd spent her life fighting for survival, for scraps, for fleeting moments of power. But he was fighting for something else entirely, something raw and primal and all-consuming, something that made her own vengeance feel petty by comparison. And so she stayed, she followed, she killed at his side. Because some fires burn too bright to look away from, even if they consume you in the end. The next morning brought not peace but whispers. The survivors of the battle spreading tales of the demon who couldn't be killed, the ghost who walked through sword strokes like mist, the revenant who laughed as he slaughtered. And with those whispers came panic. The Empire's grip on the outer territories trembling as villages once, too afraid to breathe, now dared to hope, to resist, to rebel. And Kael used that, stoked those flames with careful cruelty, targeting tax caravans, burning conscription offices, freeing prisoners from imperial dungeons, not out of kindness, never out of kindness, but because chaos was a weapon. Because fear was a tool, because every broken chain was another nail in the Empire's coffin. And as the days bled into weeks, as their ranks swelled with desperate men and women who had nothing left to lose, as the Empire's response grew more brutal, more indiscriminate, more foolish, Kael watched, waited, planned, because he knew what came next. He'd seen it play out a dozen times before. The Empire's desperation, Lucian's arrogance, the inevitable mistake that would give him the opening he needed. And when the news finally came, delivered by a ragged scout with eyes full of terror, that the Imperial Inquisitors were coming, that Lucian himself had taken the field, that the Empire was mobilizing its true strength, Kael didn't fear, didn't hesitate, didn't even blink. He just smiled, that same cold, dead smile, and said, "Good," because this was what he'd been waiting for. This was the moment he could finally stop reacting and start hunting. This was the moment he could finally look his brother in the eye and show him what 100 deaths had forged. And as the camp erupted into panicked shouts, as Sylvia grabbed his arm and demanded to know his plan, as the rebels looked to him with equal parts hope and terror, he simply turned toward the horizon, toward the storm clouds gathering over the Imperial March, and said, "We don't meet them on the field. We don't fight them head on. We make them come to us. We make them walk into hell." And then he outlined his plan. A plan so reckless, so suicidal, so utterly insane that even Sylvia paled, because it wasn't just a battle strategy. It was a death wish, a gamble where the stakes were their lives and the prize was Lucian's head. And when she asked, her voice trembling with something between awe and horror, "You're sure this will work?" He just looked at her, his eyes empty, his voice flat. It's worked before, and the way he said it, the weight behind those words, made her stomach twist, because she understood then that he wasn't guessing. He wasn't hoping, he knew, with the certainty of a man who had already lived this moment, who had already died in it. And that knowledge should have been comforting, should have been reassuring, but it wasn't, because it meant he'd seen her die too. He'd seen them all die, and he was still willing to walk this path, still willing to drag them all with him, and that more than anything. That told her exactly what kind of man he was, exactly what kind of monster the Empire had created. The trap was set in the ruins of Veldros, a cursed city buried in the wastes, a place where the ground was littered with bones and the air hummed with forgotten magic, a place the Empire avoided, a place only fools and dead men walked, which made it perfect, because Kael was both. And as they lured the Imperial forces deeper into the crumbling streets, as the Inquisitor's arrogance turned to confusion, then to unease, then to fear, as the shadows seemed to move on their own, as whispers echoed from empty alleys, as men began to vanish without a sound, Kael watched from the darkness, his breath steady, his heart calm, his blade hungry, because this was his domain now. This was his battlefield. And here, in this graveyard of empires, he was no longer the hunted. He was the hunter, the predator, the nightmare. And when Lucian finally appeared, resplendent in his golden armor, his face a mask of fury and fear, his voice booming through the ruins as he shouted threats, promises, pleas, Kael stepped from the shadows, his armor black as sin, his sword red as blood, his eyes empty as the void. And for the first time in 100 lifetimes, he saw true terror in his brother's face. True understanding, true realization, and as the ruins erupted into chaos, as the trap was sprung, as the rebels attacked from all sides, as the earth itself seemed to rise up against the Empire, Kael moved, his blade singing through the air, his body a whirlwind of death, his every strike precise, calculated, brutal. Because this wasn't just a battle, this was a message, this was a promise, this was the beginning of the end. And when he finally stood before Lucian, when he finally looked into the eyes of the man who had betrayed him 100 times over, when he finally raised his sword for the killing blow, he didn't speak, didn't gloat, didn't rage. He just smiled, that same cold, dead smile, and then he struck. Not to kill, never to kill, not yet, because death was too kind, too quick, too easy, no. He struck to maim, to cripple, to break, and as Lucian fell to his knees, as his blood painted the stones, as his screams echoed through the ruins, Kael leaned down, his voice a whisper. "This is just the beginning, brother. I'll see you again soon." And then he was gone, vanishing into the chaos like a ghost, leaving Lucian broken but alive, because some wounds were worse than death. Some pains worse than dying, and Kael had learned that lesson 100 times over. And now it was his brother's turn to learn it too. The ruins of Veldros still burned behind them as Kael and his ragged band of rebels melted into the night. The screams of dying Imperial soldiers fading into the distance, the scent of smoke and blood clinging to their clothes like a second skin, the weight of what they'd just done settling over them like a shroud. Because this wasn't just a victory, this was a declaration of war. This was a challenge thrown at the Empire's feet. This was the moment the rebellion stopped being a nuisance and started being a threat. And as they trudged through the frozen wastes, their breath fogging in the air, their bodies aching from battle, their minds buzzing with adrenaline and exhaustion, Sylvia finally broke the silence, her voice sharp as her daggers. "El, you let him live." The accusation hanging in the air like a blade because she'd seen it. They'd all seen it, Kael standing over.
"Oh, Lucian."
His sword poised to strike his vengeance finally within reach. And then walking away, leaving his brother broken, but breathing, leaving the job unfinished, leaving the wound open, and when Kael finally answered, his voice was calm, to calm the calm of a man who had already made his peace with the monster inside him. "Death is a mercy, Sylvia, and mercy is a luxury I can't afford." The words sending a chill down her spine. Because she understood then that this wasn't hesitation, this wasn't weakness, this was something far worse. This was calculation, this was cruelty. This was a man who had learned to savor vengeance like a fine wine, to draw it out to make it last, and the realization should have terrified her. But instead it ignited something dark in her own chest. What? Something hungry, something that whispered maybe he was right. Maybe some debts couldn't be paid with a quick death, maybe some sins demanded more. The days that followed were a blur of movement and violence, their small force striking like ghosts across Empire's outskirts, hitting supply lines, burning garrisons, freeing prisoners. Each attack carefully planned, meticulously executed, each one a needle driving deeper into the Empire's flesh. Each one a reminder that nowhere was safe, that no one was beyond reach, and with every victory their ranks swelled, not just with desperate peasants and disgraced soldiers, but with mages, scholars, even former Imperial officers, all drawn to the legend of the man who couldn't be killed, the ghost who walked through blades, the revenant, who had humiliated the Empire's golden prince and lived to tell the tale. And Kael used them all, molded them into weapons, honed them into tools. Because this wasn't just a rebellion anymore, this was a reckoning, and every life lost, every drop of blood spilled, was another step closer to the end he'd seen in his dreams. The end he'd died for 100 times over. It's the end where the Empire burned and Lucian knelt broken at his feet, and as their influence grew, as their attacks grew bolder, so too did the Empire's response, the streets patrolled by armored legions, the cities locked under curfew, the air thick with the scent of fear and burning flesh, the Inquisitors working day and night to root out dissent, their methods growing more brutal, more desperate, more stupid, because fear made men reckless, and recklessness led to mistakes, and mistakes were what Kael fed on. It was during one of these raids, a midnight strike on an Imperial outpost, that they found the documents hidden in a commander's locked chest, written in the Emperor's own hand, sealed with his personal sigil, and as Kael read them, his face unreadable, his hand steady, the pieces finally clicked into place. The truth he'd been searching for across 100 lifetimes laid bare in ink and parchment. Because this wasn't just a war, wasn't just a rebellion. This was a ritual. It's the Empire's endless conquests, its countless wars, all feeding something ancient and hungry that lurked beneath the capital. Something that fed on suffering, on death, on the despair of the cursed. And Lucian wasn't just a traitor, wasn't just a pawn, he was a sacrifice. The Emperor's own son offered up to the darkness in exchange for power, and Kael, with his 100 deaths, his endless cycles. He wasn't just a victim, he was the key, the linchpin, the one soul who could break the cycle or make it eternal. And as the truth settled over him, cold and heavy as a burial shroud, he understood why the Witch of Fate had smiled when she spoke of his suffering, why Lucian had been so desperate to keep him trapped in the loop, why the Empire would burn the world to keep him from reaching the capital, because if he died one more time, if he fell now, the ritual would be complete, the cycle would be unbreakable, the Empire's dominion eternal. And that, more than vengeance, more than hatred, more than anything else, was what finally made him laugh, a sound so dark, so joyless, that even Sylvia took a step back, because here, at the end of all things, he finally saw the path forward, finally understood the game he'd been forced to play. And as he turned to his followers, his eyes, burning with something beyond rage, beyond madness, beyond even vengeance, he spoke the words that would change everything. We're not running anymore. We're not hiding. We're marching on the capital. We're ending this. All of it. And if any of you want to live, you'll walk with me into hell itself. The march began at dawn, their ragged armies swelling with every mile. Every village they passed adding to their numbers, every horror the Empire had committed fueling their fury, their determination, their desperation, because this wasn't just a war anymore. This was survival. This was the last spark of light against an endless night, and as they moved, Kael could feel the world shifting around him. The air growing heavier, the sky darkening even at midday, the very earth trembling beneath their feet. Because the Empire knew they were coming, the Emperor could feel his ritual unraveling. And the closer they got to the capital, the more the world itself seemed to resist them. Storms appearing from nowhere, roads twisting back on themselves. Men vanishing in the night only to be found days later, their bodies drained of blood, their faces frozen in terror. But Kael pushed them forward, relentless, unstoppable, a force of nature given human form. Because he'd died 100 times to reach this moment, he'd suffered more than any man should bear. And nothing, not the Empire, not the gods, not hell itself, would stop him now. They reached the black gates at midnight, the massive obsidian walls of the capital looming before them like a nightmare given form, the air thick with the stench of rotten magic, the sky above churning with unnatural storms. And as Kael stood before the gates, his army at his back, his sword in his hand, his heart steady as a drumbeat, he didn't speak, didn't rally them with pretty words, didn't promise victory or survival because they all knew the truth. This was the end, one way or another. And as the gates began to creak open, as the Imperial legions poured forth, their armor gleaming in the torchlight, their weapons hungry, their faces masks of hatred and fear, Kael simply raised his sword, took a breath, and charged. Not because he expected to live, not because he believed in victory, but because after 100 deaths, after a lifetime of suffering, this was the only thing left to do, the only thing that mattered, the only thing that could finally set him free. The black gates exploded inward in a shower of obsidian shards as Kael's blade met the ancient magic binding them, the shockwaves sending Imperial soldiers flying like ragdolls, their screams drowned beneath the thunderous collapse of stone and spellwork, the ground itself splitting open beneath their feet, as if the earth recoiled from the violence about to unfold. The air thick with the scent of ozone and blood. The rebel army surging forward like a tidal wave of rage and desperation, their weapons glinting in the hellish light of the capital's unnatural storms. Their voices rising in a wordless roar that shook the very foundations of the Empire, and at their head Kael moved like death incarnate. His sword a silver blur, his armor black as the void between stars, his eyes burning with a light that wasn't entirely human. Every step carrying him deeper into the heart of the nightmare. He'd spent 100 lifetimes trying to escape. Every strike carving a path through the Imperial ranks with terrifying precision. Because this wasn't battle anymore. This was butchery. This was the culmination of every death, every betrayal, every moment of agony he'd endured. And he would savor every second of it. The streets of the capital ran red as the fighting spilled into the city proper. The narrow alleys and grand boulevards transformed into killing grounds, the rebels using every trick Kael had taught them, every dirty tactic he'd learned across countless battlefields, ambushing patrols from rooftops, collapsing buildings on advancing legions, turning the Empire's own war machines against them. while Kael himself cut a straight path toward the imperial palace, his progress relentless, unstoppable, a force of nature given human form. The bodies piling up behind him in grotesque mounds, the air filled with the screams of the dying and the maddening whispers of the capital S hidden horrors, the very stones beneath his feet pulsing with unnatural energy as the Emperor's ritual strained against the tide of violence, threatening to unravel it, and as he fought, as he killed, as he carved his way through flesh and magic alike, Kael could feel the Witch of Fate's eyes on him, her presence lurking at the edges of his perception, her laughter echoing in his skull like a half-remembered nightmare. But he ignored her, pushed forward, because this time, he wouldn't be distracted. This time, he wouldn't fall for her games. This time, he would reach the Emperor and end this, once and for all. The palace gates loomed before him, wrought from black iron, and etched with runes that made the eyes bleed to look upon, guarded not by mortal soldiers but by the Emperor's personal elite. Men and women who had sold their souls for power, their bodies twisted by dark magic into something barely human, their weapons humming with cursed energy, their faces masks of fanatical devotion. And as they charged, Kael met them with a smile that would haunt the survivors' dreams for whatever short lives they had left. His blade moving faster than thought, his body dodging strikes with impossible grace, every movement honed by 100 lifetimes of combat, every strike carrying the weight of every death he'd suffered. And as the last of the elites fell, their blood sizzling on the rune-carved stones, Kael placed his hand on the palace gates and felt the ancient magic within them recoil from his touch. The curses unraveling at his presence, the locks shattering like glass, because he was the anomaly. The broken piece, the one soul the Emperor's ritual couldn't account for. And as the gates swung open with a groan that shook the heavens, revealing the nightmare within, Kael stepped forward into the heart of darkness, into the end of all things, into the moment he'd died 100 times to reach. The throne room was a cathedral of suffering, the walls lined with writhing figures trapped in eternal agony, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes pleading for a death that would never come, the air thick with the stench of rotting flesh and burning magic. The ceiling lost in a swirling vortex of black energy that pulsed like a diseased heart, and on the throne, clad in robes woven from the hair of the dead, sat the Emperor, his face hidden behind a mask of gold and bone, his fingers tapping idly on the armrests carved from children's skulls. His voice, when he spoke, like the grinding of tombstones. "Ah, the little rat returns, dragging his filth into my halls." The words dripping with contempt, with amusement, with something almost like pride. And beside him, clad in chains of living shadow, knelt Lucian, his once proud face now gaunt and hollow. His eyes empty of everything but terror, his body trembling like a leaf in a storm. And as Kael stepped forward, his sword dripping black blood onto the polished obsidian floor, the Emperor laughed, a sound that made the very air vibrate with wrongness. "You think this is victory? You think this changes anything? You are but the latest in a long line of fools who thought to defy me. And like all the others, you will break, you will kneel, you will become another brick in the foundation of my eternal reign." And with a wave of his hand, the Emperor unleashed the full force of the ritual, the vortex above twisting into a gaping maw, the trapped souls shrieking as their essence was ripped away, the very fabric of reality straining as the Emperor reached across time itself to undo Kael's existence, to erase him from every life, every death, every moment he'd ever lived. The pain was beyond anything Kael had ever known, beyond anything any mortal could endure and remain sane. Body unraveling at the molecular level, his mind fracturing across timelines. His very soul being torn apart, stitch by agonizing stitch, the memories of 100 deaths flashing before his eyes, only to be ripped away. The faces of everyone he'd ever known, dissolving into nothingness. The Emperor's laughter ringing in his ears like the tolling of a funeral bell, and in that moment, on the edge of oblivion, Kael did the one thing the Emperor hadn't anticipated, the one thing the ritual couldn't account for. He stopped fighting, stopped resisting, stopped clinging to the anger and hatred that had sustained him through 100 lifetimes, and instead, for the first time since his first death, he let go, surrendered completely, not to the Emperor, not to the ritual, but to the truth he'd been running from all along, that none of this mattered, that his vengeance was meaningless, that his vengeance is variant, that his vengeance is at his vengeance, that his sufferance is embraced, and his Sephiroths embraced, and his empternesses, and embracing is to something menacing excenery and exempting scenery. Intrenting, sappary, and imbemming, and impenent, remin, rain, run, red, and pray, risen, brim, imbemming, roin, ran, line, one, I had, entity, sign of saw to it there, it's the truth, The vortex shuddered. The Emperor's confidence flickered for the first time in centuries, because the one thing the darkness couldn't consume was nothingness. The one thing the ritual couldn't break was someone already broken, and in that moment of perfect emptiness, Kael found the weapon he'd been searching for across 100 lifetimes. Not hatred, not rage, not vengeance, but the absolute. Unshakable certainty that nothing mattered, not even his own existence, and with that knowledge burning in his hollow chap, he took a step forwarding in his hollow chap. He took a stemper then another. The Emperor. The Emperor sliding. The sword riser alt. Where to wear him, by yonder blurring, with praying or room, sip yourself from one wreck when went in by walls I swore and we went to the when I was and to off with I so the tool and the You're right, none of this matters, but I'm going to kill you anyway. And then he struck. The blade pierced the Emperor's chest with a sound like 1,000 mirrors shattering. The golden mask splitting down the middle to reveal a face that was in T. A face at all but a yawning void. Screaming abyss. A hunger-given form. The vortex above convulsing as the ritual collapsed in on itself. The trapped souls wailing as they were finally, mercifully released. The palace shaking to its foundations as centuries of stolen power erupted outward in a cataclysmic wave. The shockwave ripping through the capital like the fist of an angry god. Toppling towers, shattering windows, sending cracks racing through the streets like veins of lightning, and at the epicenter of it all, Kael stood unmoved, his sword still buried in the Emperor's chest. His eyes locked on those of the dying monster who had orchestrated his suffering. The creature that had once been a man gasping out its final, desperate words. You fool, you have no idea what you've done, what you've unleashed. Before dissolving into ash, the throne crumbling to dust beneath him, the chains holding Lucian shattering into nothingness. The palace itself beginning to collapse as the magic sustaining it failed, and as the world fell apart around them, Kael turned to his brother. The man who had betrayed him in 100 different ways across 100 different lives, and saw not an enemy, not a rival, not even a person, just another broken thing, another victim of the Emperor's hunger, another soul trapped in a game none of them had ever truly understood, and in that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember: pity. The ceiling collapsed with a roar, the walls tumbling inward, the floor cracking open to reveal the abyss beneath. And as the world ended around them, Kael grabbed Lucian's arm and ran, not toward salvation, not toward escape, but simply because running was all there was left to do. The two brothers fleeing the ruins of the nightmare they'd helped create, the weight of centuries of hatred and betrayal hanging between them. Unspoken, unresolved, unimportant, because in the end, none of it had ever mattered. Not really. And as they burst onto the palace steps, into the chaos of a capital tearing itself apart into the dawn of a world without an empire, Kael realized with grim amusement that after 100 deaths, after a lifetime of suffering, he'd finally gotten what he wanted. He was free, and it meant absolutely nothing. The capital burned like a dying star, its once mighty towers collapsing into rivers of molten stone, its streets choked with the ashes of the dead. The sky a swirling maelstrom of smoke and embers, the air thick with the screams of the doomed and the triumphant. The Empire's final moments a symphony of destruction that shook the very foundations of the world, and amidst the chaos, Kael stood motionless, his sword hanging limp at his side, his armor scorched and broken, his body aching with wounds that would have killed a lesser man 10 times over, his mind strangely empty. The fire of vengeance that had sustained him through 100 lifetimes reduced to cold ashes in his chest. The weight of what he'd done settling over him like a shroud, because this wasn't victory, this wasn't justice. This was just another kind of death, another ending in a life that had known to many. And as he watched the flames consume the remnants of the empire that had shaped him, broken him, remade him, he realized with bitter clarity that he had no idea what came next, no purpose left to drive him forward, no hatred left to fuel him, just an endless, yawning emptiness that echoed the void in the Emperor's broken mask. Lucian collapsed beside him, his once pristine robes now tattered and stained, his golden hair matted with blood and soot, his hands trembling like those of an old man, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes wide with shock and something dangerously close to understanding. Because he'd seen it too, the truth at the heart of the Empire, the horror they'd both served in their own ways, the machine that had chewed them up and spat them out 100 times over. And when he finally spoke, his voice was raw, broken, barely recognizable. "What now, brother?" The word brother hanging between them like a knife balanced on its edge, weighted with centuries of betrayal and bloodshed, yet somehow still carrying a faint echo of the boys they'd once been, before the Empire, before the lies, before the endless cycle of death and rebirth. And Kael didn't answer, couldn't answer, because the truth was, he didn't know, didn't care, the future stretching before him like a road leading nowhere. The past a chain he'd finally broken, leaving him untethered, unmoored, free in a way that felt more like falling than flying. The rebels found them as dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, their faces alight with triumph and terror in equal measure.
Ow.
Their weapons stained with the blood of the Empire's last defenders, their voices raised in songs of victory that rang hollow in Kael's ears, because they didn't understand, couldn't understand, that the war they'd won was just the prelude to something worse. The Emperor's death not an ending, but an unraveling. The dark magic that had sustained the Empire for centuries now unbound, untethered, free to seep into the world like poison into a wound. And as they crowded around him, hailing him as their savior, their king, their god, Kael felt nothing but a dull, distant revulsion. Their adoration as meaningless as their hatred had once been. Their dreams of a better future as fragile as glass in the face of what was coming, because he'd seen the truth in the Emperor's dying moments, felt the vast, hungry presence lurking beyond the veil, the thing the Empire had been built to worship, to feed, to keep at bay. And now the gates were open, the chains were broken, and the world would burn for it. Sylvia pushed through the crowd, her crimson hair dull with ash, her daggers still dripping blood, her eyes, sharp as ever, but shadowed with something new, something dark, because she'd seen it too. The cracks forming in the world, the whispers growing louder at the edges of reality, the nightmares spilling into waking life. And when she reached Kael, she didn't bow, didn't praise him, didn't even smile. She just grabbed his arm and hissed, "We need to go now," her voice low and urgent, her grip like iron. Because she'd been to the palace vaults, she'd seen what the Emperor had been hiding, what the ritual had truly been meant to contain. And the sight had stolen the breath from her lungs and the warmth from her bones. And as Kael met her gaze, he saw the same hollow understanding there that lived in his own chest. The knowledge that their war had been nothing but children squabbling on the edge of the abyss, and now the abyss was waking up. They fled as the first tremors began, the ground splitting open like rotten fruit, the sky tearing itself apart at the seams, the air filling with a sound like 1,000 voices screaming in unison. The rebels' cheers turning to shrieks of terror as the world itself seemed to rebel against them. Buildings collapsing into newly formed chasms. Men and women vanishing into sudden bursts of black flame, the very fabric of reality twisting and warping like a living thing in agony. And as Kael ran, dragging Lucian behind him, Sylvia at his side, he realized with grim certainty that this was his fault, his doing, his final, terrible gift to the world that had made him suffer. Because in killing the Emperor, in breaking the ritual, he'd torn open a door that was never meant to be opened. And what came through would make the Empire's worst atrocities look like kindness in comparison. The city gates loomed before them, half collapsed but still standing, a fragile promise of escape, of survival, of maybe, just maybe, finding a way to fix what he'd broken. But as they reached them, a figure stepped from the shadows, her form flickering like a candle in the wind, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. Her eyes pools of endless black, the witch of fate finally revealing herself in full, no longer content to watch from the edges, no longer amused by their petty struggles, because the game had changed, the rules had been rewritten, and she was here to collect. Her voice when she spoke like nails scraping against bone. "Oh, Kael, my dear, sweet, stupid Kael. Did you really think it would be that easy? Did you really think you could win?" Her laughter sending spiders of ice crawling down his spine, because he knew now with terrible clarity that she'd never been on the Emperor's side, never been on anyone's side but her own, and the Empire's fall. His suffering, Lucian's betrayal, all of it had been pieces on her board, moves in a game he'd never even realized he was playing. And as she raised a hand, the world around them froze, the chaos pausing mid-collapse, the screams cutting off abruptly, time itself grinding to a halt, leaving them trapped in a moment stretched to infinity. Her smile widening as she savored their horror, their understanding, their despair. "You were never meant to break the cycle, Kael. You were meant to complete it, and now, at last, you have." The truth hit him like a hammer to the chest. The pieces slotting together with cruel precision, the realization that every death, every betrayal, every moment of suffering had been leading here, to this moment, to this choice. Because the ritual had never been about sustaining the Empire. It had been about keeping something far worse imprisoned, and the Emperor, for all his cruelty, had been the jailer, not the king. And Kael, with his 100 deaths, his endless resurrections, had been the key, the sacrifice. The one soul with the power to break the seals or make them eternal, and in his rage, in his hunger for vengeance, he'd chosen wrong, he'd doomed them all. And as the witch's laughter echoed through the frozen world, as the first cracks of something vast and terrible began to form in the sky, as the weight of his failure threatened to crush him where he stood, Kael did the only thing he had did, the only thing he had did, the only thing that he embraced the Wooly who had bladed by, completely where we had obeyed. The void of died, in the voidian completed, in the binian to made, and he bleed, pleady too, pulley, completely, pimply, kinly, plea, and a plan, piss, poor, and free within, is and fan, powers away, I did it up, so I say we are wise, and without reservation, because if he was the key, then he would be the lock too. If he was the sacrifice, then he would be the altar as well. If he was the one who had doomed the world, then he would be the one to save it, even if it meant erasing himself from existence entirely. The witch's smile faltered as she felt it, the shift in him, the change. Her eyes widening with something almost like fear as Kael began to glow with a light that wasn't light at all, but the absence of it. A darkness so pure it hurt to look at, a void that drank in everything around it, the frozen time, the broken world. The witch's own terrible power, all of it flowing into him, through him, becoming him. And as she screamed, as she fought, as she begged, Kael ignored her, his gaze turning inward, his mind focusing on the one thing that mattered, the one chance he had to fix this, to undo what he'd done, to rewrite the ending of the story he'd been trapped in for so long. And with a final shuddering breath, he let go. Not of life, not of death, but of himself, his name, his memories. His very existence unraveling like a thread pulled from a tapestry, the world around him rewinding, the damage repairing, the abyss repanding, the abyss repairing. The bitchers are screamed, the witches scrented, the witches screeds is screeding. Tayward, to all might, to woward, and abyss on, by word, at with the wary. by and with their men by and with or and by where with select or and with when I read away with done and return some and we sit and I we send it down I sigh to whoop and I where we sit out about what I where it's I did that whoop where Lucian had never betrayed him, where the ritual had never been cast, where the world was whole and unbroken. And as the last of him faded, as the last spark of Kael Arden winked out of existence, he felt something he hadn't felt in 100 lifetimes' peace. The world began again, the sun rising over a city that had never known an empire, the streets alive with laughter instead of screams, the air clean of smoke and blood, the people free of chains and fear, and in a small house on the edge of town, a boy opened his eyes. His name on the tip of his tongue, a dream of 100 lives fading like mist in the morning light, a strange, hollow feeling in his chest that he couldn't explain, a whisper of something vast and terrible just beyond the edge of memory. And as his brother called his name from downstairs, his voice bright with joy, unburdened by centuries of guilt and betrayal, the boy smiled, shook his head, and went to breakfast, the ghost of a man who had never existed fading into the dawn.